God still calls us to live in a love relationship. And so when we break that or we hurt that way, the classifications the church still has when talking about sin, we still use these: mortal and venial. Mortal being something, the language they use sometimes is grave or serious. Venial, they don't use any kind of description. It's just venial. Not as grave. But, personally, when the church did their reform of the sacrament, they didn't change this language. This is scholastic language. Kind of the language that you'll hear from St. Thomas Aquinas. And St. Thomas Aquinas greatly influenced the church at the time of the Reformation. So they didn't do away with this. And I think today we still get ourselves in trouble when we continually try to say, well, Father Dane, I wasn't sure if that was a mortal sin or if that was a venial. Because one is very serious. Why? Because the mortal is considered, if it's very serious, you have severed your relationship with God and or your neighbor. Usually you always talk about it in realms of God. You've severed your relationship. And people always think of the big sins, or what people classify as big sins. Can you name some of them? Murder. Adultery. Apostasy. Those are the three big that have always been the three big sins in the church. And historically, when someone committed one of those major sins, there were some tremendous consequences in order to repair or to get back in the fold.
What's apostasy?
It's denying the faith.
Okay.
To deny the faith. So we have these that are still used, but I always ask the question. Someone would say, well, what are venial sins? Well, Father Danny, I need to confess these are my sins. I've been a pretty good person. I really haven't done anything really bad. They're thinking murder, adultery, fornication, apostasy. I haven't done anything really bad. But here, these are the things I need to tell you about. And they go through their list. Speak about what they are. And I'm sitting there as a confessor thinking like, what you just described to me, I think that's pretty serious. See, I think this classification has gotten us in trouble because we have classified and said, these are real bad ones and these are not. But I'll use the example, we have a seminarian with us this year who's on his pastoral year. And he was preaching the other night after I had preached. And he talked about the sin of slander. He started by talking about how many times do we find ourselves begin to involve ourselves in gossip. He said, it starts off innocent. Let me tell you about what happened, what I just heard. And the next thing you know, it's begun to snowball. The next thing you know, by the time you leave that little coffee place, you and two others have completely destroyed the character of this individual. Whether it's right or wrong, you've chosen to spread it out. And those 3 or 4 or 5 people, they're going to go to some other place and meet with someone else somewhere and unintentionally will say, "Okay, you wouldn't believe what I heard." You see what happens? We don't like to talk about it as slander. We don't like to say that it's serious, but we can really destroy a person's character and name sometimes. And again, I think most of the time those things happen we're not thinking about it. We get involved in a conversation, and before you know it, it gets to a place, and you're going like, "No, how do I get out of this?" Anytime people talk about mortal sin, the church has always said that sin is not just It's not just something that you do, but it can be an attitude. It's not just an action or a lack thereof. There is what's called sins of, remember the old? Commission and omission. Sins that we commit, I actively do, and sins that where I should have acted and I didn't. Like, remember the story of the man that was hurt on the side of the road, and one person just kept passing by. I think those are sins of omission. Why didn't they? But I think sin is more than just, if you're looking at realms of relationship, it's more than just the act, but it can be the attitude. Someone comes and says, you know, Father Danny, I have a lot of trouble with African American people. When I see African American people or Hispanic people or German American people or whatever, Indian people, Pakistani people, when I see people of that particular origin of culture, my heart races. I immediately draw a judgment upon them. Just where I'm at. And some of that may come out of a real lived experience, perhaps, where we've been hurt, had a bad experience, etc., etc. But when I have that attitude that every time I see a person of that culture or nationality, or we could even say religion, wow. And we might say, well, it doesn't hurt anyone. But one of the things that I find in realms of racism or prejudice, beyond just culture and race, is that we, especially as adults, and especially if we're parents or grandparents, it is so easy that that attitude gets passed to those we're called to take care of. Maybe unintentionally, but it does. So there are ways in which our attitudes can, I think, whether they're serious, gravely serious or not, I think they can be sinful.